a Superman action figure in a toy coffin, a blue shirt and red jacket, a first flight in the sun above the Arctic tundra. These are some of the moments that define my Superman fandom. Together on this podcast, we journey across time and media to examine, discover, and reconsider the creative visions that have shaped the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the Brian Azzarello, Jim Lee storyline, Superman for Tomorrow, is real-life pastor Craig Higgins. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Anthony. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
My pleasure. You and I met through our old comic shop in Scarsdale, New York, Alternate Realities. You were a customer there. I worked there for many years, and we've kept in touch.
Missed.
Much missed, yes, the late, great Alternate Realities. But you and I have kept in touch over Facebook. You were on my other podcast, My Comic Shop History, a few years ago. And, you know, when I started mapping out this episode and sort of thinking about exploring these religious parallels between Superman and certain biblical figures, specifically Moses and Jesus, you were the first person I thought of. And then, hand in hand with that, I was thinking about revisiting this For Tomorrow storyline because it really taps into a lot of those ideas. And I thought it would pair really nicely with these larger questions. And so you were a natural fit for this episode.
Well, I'm glad you thought of me. And I had not read For Tomorrow when this originally came out over 15 years ago. Now, I wasn't reading a lot of DC titles at the time, though that was predominantly what I read as a kid growing up. And so it gave me an excuse to buy the deluxe graphic novel and actually read it and parts of it reread over and over. So it's a real treat for me.
Yeah, and if you don't mind just explaining a little bit about your background, what is your denomination, and you know where do you preach?
I'm a Presbyterian minister and at Trinity Presbyterian Church, which is in Westchester County, New York. I'm actually the founding pastor. This was what's called a new church development. Rather than existing churches, when parts of the population are growing, rather than building, bigger churches, part of the job is to establish new congregations. And so my wife and I moved here now 27 years ago to be the founding pastor of this new work, and we've just stayed here. We both actually grew up in North Georgia, but had gone to grad school in Philadelphia, and we were back in Georgia. I worked as a Presbyterian campus minister for a few years down there, but you couldn't get a good cannoli. And after living in Philadelphia, we knew we had to come. We had to be back in the Northeast.
Well, we're glad to have you here. I'll share as much as, the typical advice, right, is don't talk about religion or politics, at the dinner table. And perhaps that applies to podcasts as well. Let me just share, I'll get personal for a moment here. So I was raised Catholic. It was probably not a surprise for someone named Anthony Desiato, my Italian heritage. So I was raised Catholic. I was in Catholic school from pre-K through college. But I will be honest, it's not really a part of my life now. I don't actively practice it. That being said, there's definitely a lot, especially when we talk about the parables and the lessons. There's a lot that I do find to be of value, even though I wouldn't say that I actively practice. And I lay that all out to say that I don't have an agenda with this episode. I really just think that there are these questions and ideas about Superman and the ways in which he shares these parallels with certain figures in the Bible. And again, this is not a new or groundbreaking observation. You can find plenty of articles out there on that. But I thought it would be cool to explore on the show. And so, I am coming from this, I suppose, more from, an academic standpoint more than anything else. And it's not necessarily, an agenda that I'm looking to put forth. So I just wanted to share that and put that out there as we dive in.
Well, I think that's an important thing to say. And I would say, too, to the listeners, in case anybody is thinking, I need to turn this off right now because there's some crazy pastor on here, I'm not on this for an agenda either. One of the things I always have enjoyed about certain extracurricular activities, and going to alternate realities was certainly one of them, is sometimes clergy, you can end up in a little bit of you end up sort of in a sound chamber where you're mostly talking to people who already agree with what you're trying to say, and I hate that, frankly. I uh, Not long ago, someone asked me what I did, and I said, "Oh, well, I actually am a Presbyterian minister," and they said, "Oh, I'm really surprised that you're a pastor," and then they thought they had offended me, and I said, "Well, thank you. No, I take that as a compliment that you didn't peg that right off." So I'm happy with that.
Good. No, that's great. So
Yeah,
all right, so we're on the same page, and
yeah.
hopefully our audience is as well. So I was getting at this a little bit, in terms of what inspired this episode. Um, I read Superman for Tomorrow when it first came out in 2004, 2005. Again, written by Brian Azzarello, drawn by Jim Lee and Scott Williams. And this was, on the heels of Batman Hush, which Jim Lee had
Hmm.
drawn. That was written by Jeff Loeb. And, that was, this massive story that really encapsulated the entire Batman mythology
Hmm.
and introduced you to the supporting cast and the rogues gallery. And I think there was a lot of expectation, certainly on my part as a fan, when I knew that Jim Lee was going to be drawing Superman for a year, just as he had drawn Batman. And to be honest, I guess the story, it was obviously a very, very different story than Hush was. And at the
Oh yeah.
time, it definitely didn't, I guess, meet the expectation that I had. And so I always sort of, just kind of brushed it aside. And I really didn't go back to it until now. But one of the things that got me thinking about it again was Henry Cavill, whose depiction of Superman in the films I'm a big fan of. He cited it as his favorite Superman comic book story. And I thought, well, if the guy who plays Superman, and who plays him very well, in my opinion,
Hmm.
finds something of value in this story, maybe it would be worth going back to. And then, like I said, hand in hand, I was really thinking about, doing an episode that explored, again, the ties between Superman and religion. And it just felt like this would be a perfect way to sort of combine that. And that was how we got here. And now you read
Yeah.
Superman for Tomorrow, and I'll say this, and we will there will be spoilers, as we go through this.
Yeah.
I mean, the story's many years old at this point, so hopefully no one's offended by some spoilers. But for anyone who just needs a quick refresher, so this was again a 12-part storyline by Azzarello and Lee in 2004, 2005, and the basic premise is that 1 year ago, 1 million people on Earth mysteriously vanished, including Lois Lane. And so when we pick up with Superman in this story, he's seeking the counsel of a priest, Father Daniel, and we really meet a Superman at a different point in his journey. This is a Superman in grief and really sort of struggling with what his role is going to be moving forward. And we see him in some different situations than we normally would. He inserts himself in an international conflict, for example, and that sort of raises some questions about what his role should be. So that's sort of the basic setup to it. And so now you read this for the first time for this episode, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Um, I don't know how I missed this one, except that I wasn't reading a lot of BC titles back at the time. I didn't read Hush when it first came out either, but discovered it, probably when it was 3 or 4 years old, and love one of my favorite stories. And I love Jim Lee's art in Hush. So when you mentioned For Tomorrow, and I go and I look at it, and it's art by Jim Lee. That was actually the first thing that piqued my curiosity. Is not reading it and Superman's having conversations with a priest. Is how on earth is Jim Lee going to draw Superman? And I must say, I mean, I think that's wildly successful. Um, I can see. I did not know that about Henry Cavill, but I do. You can certainly see the influence now in reflecting upon it. I like the fact that for for tomorrow is a storyline that points out that it's really hard to be Superman. As a kid growing up reading comics in the, from the mid 60s into the 70s, it seems sometimes like Superman doesn't have any problems. That was the Marvel characters had problems. Superman didn't have problems. Um, but that's one of the things that Man of Steel captures extremely well, especially I personally think the first half to two-thirds of that movie is my favorite depiction of Superman on film. I I was very critical of the ending of the movie at the time. I will say now, having gone back and watched, actually watching the Snyder cut, as they're calling it, of Justice League, frankly helped me understand more what Zack Snyder was shooting for in Man of Steel and in Batman versus Superman. But that might be a topic for another time. But and one that you've discussed to death probably on this podcast. But
Well, hold that thought. I'm just going to pause for one quick
yeah,
second here. It's so funny because Snyder's take on the character comes up in almost every episode that I do, but in my defense, it's usually the guest who brings it up. So that's the thing that's so interesting to me, regardless of where, someone falls, in terms of their opinion on Snyder's take on Superman and the other DC characters, it definitely provides a lot of fodder for conversation. And it's interesting because, Clark does have that heart to heart with a priest in the movie before he reveals himself to the world. And I do want to talk about that. And Snyder, like other creators, definitely leans into that Christ imagery. I mean, there's the moment in the movie
yes.
where Clark is on the ship with Jor-El, and then he sort of floats out, and we see him do the Christ pose. And I want to circle back to that because I want to get your opinion on all of this. But when you brought up Snyder, when you brought up Man of Steel, and then you brought up the Snyder cut of Justice League, you reminded me of something. And I've actually, believe it or not, for as much as I've talked about the Snyder cut on these podcasts, I've not talked about this yet. So fans caught this, and they posted about it on social media. I did not make any connection here, but fans pointed this out, that Superman dies in Batman v Superman. I believe this is the Ultimate Edition, the longer cut, I think. But Clark, as I like to consider him, he's Clark in these movies. I feel like that's the way he's really presented here. Clark dies at the 2-hour, 38-minute, 57 mark in Batman v Superman, and is resurrected at the exact same timestamp in the Snyder cut of Justice League. There was clearly a lot of thought that went into that,
Right.
and this next bit, it seems a bit tenuous here, but the resurrection of Lazarus in the Bible is John 11:38, so that 38 number comes up here a couple of times. But I thought that was really interesting that he dies and returns at exactly the same timestamp.
That's from everything I've read of Zack Snyder. That's not an accident. That's got to be intentional, right? How much of a coincidence could that be?
And that's the thing. It's
Yeah,
like, regardless of where you fall, there's a lot of thought, that clearly
that's
went,
right.
that clearly went into that. So, before we really dive into For Tomorrow, I guess because I've been looking forward to talking to you about that story, but I've really been looking forward to picking your brain about these larger questions. When we talk about these parallels between Superman and, figures from the Bible, again, Moses and Jesus are the two that you hear about the most, understandably. And I would like to start with Moses. I mean, my Old Testament is not great, but it seems like, especially given the fact that Superman was created by, two young Jewish guys, if they were thinking about anyone from the Bible, it very likely was Moses.
Oh, I would think so. I mean, actually, Jewish Americans have created so many of our important comic book characters, but I think that's clearly got to be the case. There's particular parallels, of course, with um, Moses' parents putting him, in the basket in the Nile to be discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. It's just hard to miss that imagery of Jor-El and Lara putting little baby Kal-El into something that looks an awful lot like a basket, and shooting him off to Earth. Um, and I know there's been multiple depictions of what that rocket ship looked like. It looked like a very simplistic rocket when I was a child, uh, to the more star-shaped things you've seen in some of the modern incarnations. But I think that very much in itself is a Moses imagery, and then Moses growing up among the Egyptians, learning the ways of the Egyptians, and then sort of only as he comes to maturity does he realize that these are not truly his people, and that he needs to serve, a higher purpose and of setting people free. Yeah, I think those parallels are, they're hard to miss. Now, some some famous writers, and particularly famous writers in the Christian tradition, would argue that, well, the most famous example would be J.R.R. Tolkien, best known for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and those things. Tolkien wrote a famous essay called On Fairy Stories. And in that piece, he talks about how, and of course, he was a Catholic Christian, very conservative Catholic Christian, as a matter of fact, Tolkien was. Um, he talks about how, from his perspective as a Christian, the story of the creation of the world, and the story of the world no longer being the way God created it to be, and the need for a redeemer. He says he sees that as sort of the true story of the world, and therefore all great stories are going to echo many of those themes. And don't get me wrong, sometimes Christians, particularly, I'm sure in other religious traditions it happens, but I think Christians are sometimes a little overly eager to look for Christ figures everywhere, and that can get very annoying, and I'm sure gets very annoying to authors. It was annoying to Tolkien. He stressed that no, he didn't see Frodo as a Christ figure any more than he saw Samwise as a Christ figure, and others. But still, that idea of the universe, God, what Joss Whedon called the powers that be, having a benevolent concern for this world with all of its fallenness and all of its pain, so that there are signs and actions that bring redemption, that bring rescue to the world. Yeah, you can't miss them. And we love these stories. How can you not love a story like that? So as I was reading For Tomorrow, and frankly, as I've read comic books since the mid '60s, um, yeah, I think I pick up. I think I see a lot of those themes, and I enjoy them. And they don't have to be overtly religious. Um, Matter of fact, sometimes Christian writers try to make them too overtly religious, and then you just have bad fiction. But
Right. Well,
yeah.
so that's an interesting point, and I was following what you were saying, and yeah, I mean, I guess there is. I mean, it makes sense that there would be this, inclination, conscious or otherwise, on the part of an audience to kind of look for that. I mean, this idea of like someone looking out for us, and you're not alone, and you look for it in your life, and it makes
Hmm.
sense that you would look for it in your stories. What's interesting though is that there's one thing when we're talking about people sort of trying to find that meaning, whether or not it's intended. But then, especially when we're talking about Superman, and especially when we're talking about the past few decades, you don't have to look hard.
Oh no, no, it's there, and I think it's intended. Yeah, I don't think it's an accident that and it's not just that one illustration. I think again to go back to the most recent DC movies, when we see in Batman v Superman where Superman takes this blast and is shriveled and dying, and of course this comes largely out of the Frank Miller depiction of him in in the Dark Knight stuff. But again, flying up to be exposed to the sun and stretching his arms out in this very very much reminiscent of what's often called, often in churches you will see not only a crucifix, but you'll see what's called a Christus Rex of the risen Jesus extending his arms, still in that same cruciform, cross-like depiction, but it's more of a resurrection imagery. And I think you see that in in the Snyder films as well.
Yeah, I made a little list in my head. I didn't have to look it up. I would just like ran through. I was like, okay, like what are all of the instances of Clark or Superman doing the Christ pose in the, especially in the TV and movie adaptations. And
Yeah.
you see it a lot. It's, my favorite depiction is Smallville. And at the end of season 9, he's fighting Zod
Oh, yeah.
and he falls off the building in the Christ pose. He's plunged the blue kryptonite dagger into himself in order to defeat Zod, long story short. And he's falling back off the building in the pose. Again, obviously Snyder used that pose, numerous times, the ones we just talked about. And then in the Snyder cut of Justice League, after he's resurrected and he flies up above the earth to get that recharge and, and he's doing that again.
Right. Yeah.
Superman Returns, Bryan Singer, used that pose as well. So you definitely, you see a lot of it. I'm sure there are other examples, but those were just the ones that without even thinking, they just, instantly came to mind. I guess, I mean, what is your overall feeling about something like that, especially as a man of faith and as a pastor? Is it something where you're like, I get why they're doing that and I get why it appeals to people? Or is there any sort of sense of like, hey, this is not really appropriate or sacrilegious? I mean, where do you sort of fall on that?
Oh, I not in the slightest do I see it as inappropriate or sacrilegious. And now maybe that's because I'm with Tolkien. From my personal faith perspective, I do believe that this story is the true story of the world, and therefore to see the story of God's redeeming the world echoed in various ways in other stories, I don't find surprising or shocking, and I'm happy for other people to see that. I do think that, and I have not, I need to read Glenn Weldon's biography of Superman. I've read his book on Batman. I haven't read his book on Superman yet, and he may go into this. Glenn Weldon, I will say, is one of my favorite critics when it comes to superhero genre work. I'm a real listener to Pop Culture Happy Hour, the podcast that he's on. But I'm sure that Moses imagery, though, had to be central for Siegel and Schuster, just because, particularly, we're talking about being a Jew in 1930s America was a very, very difficult and even dangerous thing. And the idea that just as the people of Israel needed this Savior in Moses, that's what they needed. And so the whole idea of, I think the parallel there between Moses in his basket in the bulrushes and little baby Kal-El in his rocket headed to Kansas, I think that parallel is very clear. And, face it, we live in an era where anti-Semitism is on the uptick in America significantly. It's probably not a bad idea for a few more people to be aware of that imagery. These are, again, not the most dangerous times in American history for our Jewish neighbors, but it's not moving in the right direction right now. And I think it's a good thing for people to be aware of that, of the heritage of the creators of Superman, and how they almost certainly intended that imagery.
No, that's a great point, and I'll say, and my audience is aware of this. I recently spent an episode in the golden age of Superman comics and other media adaptations, and it really was fascinating to read those earliest stories, and I definitely came away, with a deeper appreciation for Siegel and Schuster and their background and what they put into the character. I will say, for myself, definitely the Christ parallels were always more at the forefront in my mind due to my own background. And again, all of these depictions where, the creators really leaned into it. I'll say this though, my thesis has been, and again, I don't think I'm not really breaking new ground here, but my feeling has always been that, Richard Donner's Superman the movie in 1978 cemented the Christ parallel. And let me also say, this is actually the first episode that I'm recording since the passing of Richard Donner. So We extend our condolences, to his family, and very sorry to hear about his passing. And we're going to do an episode on Superman the movie down the line, and I'm looking forward to getting to that. I mean, certainly, its contribution to the Superman mythology was vast. So we'll definitely be talking about that. But I've always looked at the way they told that origin story in Superman the movie. It is beat for
Hmm.
beat the Christ story. It's like we see
Oh,
the
absolutely.
right. It's like
Yeah.
in the Bible, right? We have the birth of Jesus. Here we have the Immaculate Conception and the birth of Jesus. Here we have the departure from Krypton and the arrival on Earth. We visit with both Jesus and Clark once during their adolescence. Then they're
Hmm.
gone for a long
Right.
time, and then they enter the world as adults and begin their mission. And again, both sent to Earth, by their fathers to save the Earth, which again is a shift because in the and to your point, going back to with the Moses in the Golden Age, it's like it was really just to save him. Here, yes, that's obviously a
Right.
major piece of it, but through the instruction that he receives from Jor-El and the fortress, like there is also this idea of like you are going to save them.
Right. Absolutely. And that and again, you know the comics better than I do, but it seemed to me, and I have not seen Superman the movie in 20 years, and echoing your words about to Donner's friends and family. I mean, what a brilliant director. I was actually the other day I was in the car making a mental list of all the Donner movies I need to go back and rewatch. And Superman's at the top of the list. I haven't seen the first Lethal Weapon movie, I think, since it was brand new. I need to go back and watch that one. But yes, at what point in the comics continuities was the emphasis that Superman's Kryptonian parents were not just trying to save him, but were sending him to save the people of the Earth? It to me, it always seemed that was really a turning point with Donner's film in '77. I don't remember now. In '77, I was when that movie came out, I was a junior in high school or a sophomore in high school, and my comics. I think I've told you this before. Um, I have been a sporadic, fairly steady comic reader, but there were a few years in late high school and college when I really wasn't reading comic books. To which my wife, now occasionally we met in college, and she goes, "I did not know about this comics thing when I married you." And so that's usually what she says when she finds another box of comic books somewhere. Um, and I'm like, but it's okay. But anyway, I don't know where that motif that Superman is being sent by his father in this case to be the savior of the world. I mean, yeah, that's pretty hard to miss in terms of sort of a Christological motif.
And if anyone listening to this or watching this has an answer, please share it. As I always say, we're on this journey together here. I recently on this podcast, I went through basically all of the various retellings of the origin story, pre-crisis and post-crisis, and especially when we're talking pre-crisis, even the time around this time of Superman the
Hmm.
movie. I mean, it was really an escape mission. I mean, it was really like just getting this baby off the planet. There really wasn't, unless I'm forgetting or if I missed something. And again, if I did, please someone let me know. But that really was not the driving theme of that. I mean, it was really just that, what you saw over and over and over in all of these stories was poor Jor-El pleading with the Science Council and being
Exactly.
ignored. And it was like, this was all he could do. So
Hmm.
yeah, this idea, I mean, I really feel like it was the movie that like really, that's really where we see that, not just first, but primarily.
Well, that's certainly my recollection. And I can remember seeing Superman the movie in high school and thinking, oh, wow, that is cool. And and I think that the more elaborate depictions of all the Kryptonian artifacts and technology in the various incarnations of the Fortress of Solitude, I think a lot of that goes back to that contribution, to Donner's contribution. Uh, so yes, if you find out that had been introduced in comics before 1977, let me know too, or I'll catch it on the podcast. I have missed several of these, and so I'll have to go back and re-listen to that one on the origin stories. I haven't heard that podcast, but
Oh, I hope you
yeah,
enjoy it. That was one of those
yeah,
two episodes were our lengthiest episodes by far,
yeah.
but they were so much fun. It was really fascinating. But so, that's basically part one of my thesis here, that, Superman
Yeah.
the movie really cemented the Christ parallel. But then the other piece of the part two is, and this is personal to me because it's where I got into comics, but the death, and more specifically, I guess, the return of Superman. I think once you have
Mhm.
a death and resurrection. And now, I mean, the comic book story, of course, was monumental and an iconic part of the comic book bibliography. But now this has been depicted on screen as well. And I feel like in the minds of the public at large, this idea that, Superman dies and comes back at some point, I mean, that's now, I think, an indelible part of his story. And so I feel like that, hand in hand with what we've been talking about, it's like you cannot get away from it now.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I kind of, as an old comic purist, you hate to give that much credit to the films. I don't think that was ever as much a part of the story, though, before Snyder. No, I think now it is, for whatever that means. It's Superman canon, where I mean, you know, I have a lot of friends who are not into comics. When the Black Panther movie came out a few years ago, I can't tell you how many people, and yes, mostly white people, who said to me, did you ever heard of Black Panther before his appearance, in the comics?" And I'm like, I was reading Black Panther in the '60s, so yes, I don't think I had the original appearance of '66, but there used to be Marvel had a series that would reprint Fantastic Four stories, and I think that's the one I had in like '68, '69, which had the origin of Black Panther, who is it's in a Fantastic Four story where he makes his first appearance, as many of your listeners know. Um, so most of the folks that a lot of my friends who come to me with their comics questions. I have a friend of mine who's another Presbyterian pastor in central Pennsylvania. He's like, I always like to see comic book movies with Craig because I can go, what's going on, and I can fill him in a little bit. I don't think most of them knew about the stories of the death of Superman, which this was not, the films were not a radical departure in some ways from some of those stories. And uh, the costuming when he came back was a little different, but I mean, I don't think that was part of the collective consciousness of Superman. Everybody knows the origin story. Everybody knows, leap tall buildings in a single bound and all the stuff from the old '50s shows, and well, in the cartoons before that. But now everyone knows the death and resurrection. And of course, that just makes this idea of Superman as a Christ figure more pronounced in the general consciousness, which is frankly, I think, too, what makes some of these stories that deal more with that deal more honestly with what it would be like to be this alien living on Earth, what it would be like to have such incredible responsibilities. Uh, I mean, you can get into all sorts of interesting parallels in Christian theology about that, but it's just good storytelling to emphasize how difficult it would be. I thought it For Tomorrow does a wonderful job of, also picked up in the films more recently, of how does Superman not hear everything all the time? Um, because while there are these parallels, he's not a divine being. He's not God as that would be understood in the great monotheistic religions. He's not, omniscient. He doesn't just know everything intuitively, which is how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have depicted, have classically described one of the attributes of God. Just the difficulty of being this person who bears such incredible responsibility. It really makes me look back at the very, very lighthearted Superman of my childhood. Um, and you sort of realize just how thin that storyline is. It's you know I don't think the 1966 Batman series ever dealt with the traumatic origin of that character either. So, um, and so that's where I appreciate that some of these more recent tellings, and For Tomorrow is a prime example of that. I mean, this graphic novel, this series of books is so well written. People who don't read comics often don't realize the quality of the writing that goes into comics, and in some ways it's like writing poetry. You have confined space. You can't just pontificate forever, kind of like I'm doing now. You really have to say a few words in a short period of time, and in a short space. And this book, I think, does that brilliantly, picking up um, just the angst of being Superman, and frankly, on Father Daniels. Um, I'm often disappointed, of course, with how clergy are depicted in media. It's either we're sinister or just kind of you know infinitely lame. And here is a depiction of a priest who is struggling with his faith, who has questions, which, in all honesty, we do. Um, just the whole interchange early on in For Tomorrow, where they keep making, and it becomes a repeating joke throughout the book of, "Are you sure you can't read minds?" And "You're a good listener." At one point, Superman says to Father Daniel, "You're not just a good listener; you're an active listener." Um, that's well written, and it's good literature. It's not just pure escapist fiction. I'm not opposed to escapist fiction. Um, but it's actually a well-written story about the issues of being a human being in the world.
It is definitely a thoughtful story, and after a quick commercial break, we will finally dive more fully into For Tomorrow. But this has been fascinating to me so far, and hopefully to our audience. The last thing I want to say, just before we jump to the commercial break, I too, and my audience is familiar with this by now. I too love the stories that really examine what it would be like to be Clark Kent, Superman, especially,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just in the real world generally, and especially in the modern world. And I'll quote Smallville. I'll go back to that again.
Yeah.
To be given the powers of a god, yet live as a man, is an impossible odyssey. And that's the journey
Right.
that he's on. And so,
Exactly.
so when we get stories like what Snyder gave us in the movies, and like what Azzarello did, I don't think I was as hot on the story as you were, though I found a lot of it really interesting. But I did appreciate that we were, especially this idea of a grieving Superman and what that would do to the character.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that was an honest
Right.
depiction. So we'll circle right back to that when we come back. But first, just a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. If you enjoy this show, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. I also hope you'll consider joining my Patreon community. The support of my patrons enables me to produce this podcast, and patrons get rewards too, including exclusive episodes, advanced listens, and more. Sign up today and get instant access to the back catalog. Visit patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all of my patrons. I truly appreciate your support. The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. And we're back, so thank you to our sponsors. I'm also happy to announce for the first time on air that Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate now of BCW Comic Supplies. So the next time you want to go place an order for bags, boards, boxes, I know there are shortages right now, but you can see what they have, and I know that they're working to restock as quickly as they can. But the next time you go to place an order, use promo code FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, promo code FSP, and you get 10% off your order, and it helps support this podcast. So I hope you'll use promo code FSP the next time that you order from BCW Supplies. I also just want to give a quick heads up about what we have coming up. So in 1 week, on the Patreon exclusive companion show, Digging Deeper, we're going to be talking about the new The Suicide Squad movie. So make sure you tune in for that. It'll be a lot of fun as we talk about that new movie. And then in 2 weeks, I could not be more excited for this. The whole first year of this podcast has been building towards this. An 8-part weekly, we're switching to weekly for September and October, an 8-part weekly event called Crisis Till Death, where we're going to be talking about the burn run, the post-burn run, the lead up to the death of Superman, and, of course, the death and return of Superman. It's going to be an epic, legendary run of episodes. You don't want to miss this. Crisis Till Death. It kicks off at the beginning of September. An 8-part weekly event. So that's all coming up. So
That's
Pastor,
pretty impressive.
I'm very, very excited for all of this. So Pastor Craig,
that's
let's dive back into For Tomorrow. I'm glad you enjoyed it because again, I know as we talked about, you hadn't read this before, and I know you read it specifically so we could talk about it, and I appreciate it. I'm glad you liked it. Overall, I found it interesting. There were aspects that I thought, maybe could have been executed a little bit better. I didn't quite love a lot of Azzarello's dialogue. I found it to be a bit, it was philosophical and it was interesting. I know I've used the word interesting a lot, but at the same time, I found it a little bit ponderous and unnatural at times. Again, it wasn't necessarily my taste, and the story took a couple of directions that I felt there were a few aspects that I wish had kind of unfolded earlier, or we had spent more time on, because I thought they really were fascinating. But overall, I'm glad that I revisited this. I don't know that it really occupies a high spot in my list of Superman stories, but again, a great episode, a great story to at least have a discussion about.
I would actually tend to agree with that, and I'm glad you said that, because I was about to say it's your podcast, but let me ask you what you didn't like about the story. I actually tend to agree with you a little bit on the dialogue. There were moments when it did not quite ring true. The conversations between Superman and Father Daniel were obviously some of my favorites. And yes, at times they were slightly wittier. I mean, but it's like if you watch anything that Joss Whedon did, if you watch anything that Aaron Sorkin did, if you watch, I forget her name, but if you watch Gilmore Girls, wouldn't we all like to be that witty and that articulate for one day of our lives? And that's okay. I'm fine with that. I can go back and rewatch episodes of The West Wing and listen to my wife say, no one would ever say that in real life. And I'm like, yeah, but that's why this is a well-written scripted show. I did think some of the conversations with some of the dialogue with Zod toward the end, some of the dialogue with the general, some of that did not. It fell a little flat with me. It didn't quite ring true. Although again, this is a major spoiler, but the very idea that Superman would try to prevent what happened to Krypton happening to Earth by essentially creating a world using Phantom Zone technology. That I thought was a really interesting, again, yeah, don't use the word interesting so much, but it's a great storyline because it is an insight into how Superman grieves. So we start off seeing his grief by talking to a priest. We see his grief in his intervening in global affairs beyond what he would normally do or would have any sort of authority to do, which of course is also sort of picked up again in Man of Steel and other ones, who controls Does anyone have any authority over this guy? Uh, but then just see the lengths of his really desperation, just how far he would go, but without losing his core sense of mission and his core sense of identity. Um, that conflict was the part of the story that I really resonated with.
I understand it. I'll say too, there's a point in the story where he tracks down the device that was responsible for the disappearance of everyone. And he, is going to use it on himself so that he could try to find Lois. And, Batman and Wonder Woman, like, they're all trying to stop him. They're like, this is suicide. And, he says, like, if there's a chance that she's out there, I have to do this. And, in a lot of these episodes, I talk about how, being a new father has really changed the way I look at these stories. That's true here too. But as a husband, I mean, it's the sort of thing, like, if there were a chance that I could get to my wife, I would do it.
Yep. Exactly.
So that rang so true. What you hit on what I was alluding to earlier, this idea that he would create this entire world within the Phantom Zone that he could send humans to in case Earth ever met a similar fate as Krypton. That's an idea that I wish, and again, I know it was a choice to structure the story the way that it was structured and to reveal that when it was revealed. I get that. It's just maybe a matter of preference. But I wish we had spent more time with him making that decision and going through that process, because I do think that's an angle that I can't think of other stories off the top of my head that have really delved into that. And it makes, the thing that is great about it, it makes such perfect sense given where he came from. It's like at some point, it probably would be natural. It's like, well, what would I do if I were faced with something similar?
Yep. Yeah. I would agree with that. I think it would have been. And again, it's you hate to criticize people for what they didn't say that you would have liked to them to said. But I do think it would be an interesting take on the story to see the lead into those actions and to those decisions a little more, because it's a bit of a reveal in the second half of the book. But still definitely worth a reading. So to those of you who, like me, haven't read the story, I recommend it.
Where one thing that did lose me though was, and I was surprised for what was overall a pretty grounded story for the most part, aside from the fact that we have, Equus and we have the, a million people vanishing, but all that aside, but the fact that Superman used meditation on himself to make himself forget that he created this world and that he created robots to help maintain this world. Like I said, I've recently spent a lot of time in pre-crisis Superman, and robots abound, and I just, it's not my thing.
Oh, well, see, I grew up, I grew up reading Superboy, right? And, that was how high school Clark Kent maintained his secret identity, was by having Superboy robots fly around town so that people could see him. And I know, I have to say, the meditation part, and I've taught on contemplative prayer and Christian meditation. And if you know a meditation technique that can cause you to forget something of that significance, get in touch with me, because that's that I would like to know more about that. But again, it's one of those, and I, in the back of my mind, that and the robots were, I thought, the throwbacks to the 1960s when Superman had, super ventriloquism, was one of the powers. So I guess now it's super meditation that he can do that. Yeah, those were the things that fell flat. And it's a plot device. But when a plot device, glaringly has the red alert, klaxons going off and saying plot device. Yeah, that's a little tricky. And the fact that the robots are his parents and a robot Clark Kent. That one. I actually went back and had to reread that and go, wait, what?
Yeah, that did feel contrived. Yeah. I mean, that really just felt like, well, we want this moment of confusion for the audience and for Superman when he arrives there and he sees Clark Kent. Well, what would be the way to do that if he makes a Clark Kent robot? That does not really, not really track. Again, I don't want to nitpick. I think there were a lot of aspects of this that, I did think were valid choices and definitely different choices. Yeah. And again, the fact that, Superman's main scene partner for most of this story is Father Daniel. Was really cool. And I appreciate you sharing your take on the way Father Daniel was depicted and how it was a refreshing change of pace for you, given the way, members of the
Yeah.
clergy are often shown. And it's good to have some variety in terms of,
Yes.
in terms of what you see. And, when Superman first arrives and he's floating down, Father Daniel's instinct is to kneel.
Yes.
And Superman says, I don't think you want to do that.
That's actually that's a recurring theme in Scripture when angelic beings appear. You see it in the prophetic books in the Old Testament, and it's repeated a couple of times in the book of Revelation at the end of the Christian Scriptures, the New Testament, uh, where St. John, historically, St. John the Revelator is the author of the final book, and traditionally he's associated with St. John the Apostle. Scholars question how close that should be. But twice in the book of Revelation, angels appear to St. John, and he falls down to worship them. And they go, get up. I am a servant like you are. So I suspect that was immediately the image that sprang to mind there. That at the very least, Superman is seen here as an angelic being that any mere mortal would be tempted to worship. And of course, that reflects something that's found in Christian, well, in Hebrew and Christian scriptures.
And that's the sort of thing. And there have been comic book stories where I think it was actually, Superman for All Seasons is one example. Another retelling of the origin story by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, where there's a woman, Superman saves early on, and then she views him as this angelic being and worships him, and she really goes too far, and it becomes an obsession. But going back to what we were saying about the Snyder movies, I do genuinely think that is a pretty realistic and actually generous. I think it would be worse for Superman if he were real, but I do think it overall is a realistic take on how people would react. And yes, you would have, and just as the movie shows you, and in Batman v Superman, they really continue that thread where, you see all these different reactions, all these talking heads on the TVs, like wondering if he's this government agent, and others who do wonder, like, is he God or sent by God? And I mean, and again, I don't mean for this to sound like a silly question, but I don't know, as someone who, preaches to to your flock. And I mean, I don't know, like, how do you think people would react if a being like that, emerged in these times? Like, what I don't know. What do you think?
Right. I do think the Snyder movies, I agree with you. I think they get that pretty well right, although somewhat generous. I was recently a part of a discussion, just with a group within our own congregation, um, but where a question was raised. I lead a small group, affectionately known as Monday Night Theology, where it's a play on Monday Night Football, and I'm a Giants fan, so I always tell them that in the fall, if the Giants are on Monday Night Football, there will not be a meeting of Monday Night Theology. But we one of the questions that was raised, and that's the idea in this group: all questions are fair play, is similar, which is, and this came out, of course, right after some of the video footage of UFOs was declassified. People were eagerly awaiting the report, which has since come out, which was somewhat underwhelming. But people started asking, how would people respond, and how would it affect Christian theology if intelligent life on other planets is definitely confirmed? And my answer is that does not, I don't think it poses some sort of existential threat to the Christian faith. There's a astrophysicist named Deborah Harzma who has written a piece on this. She's the executive director of an organization called BioLogos, which mostly focuses on the intersection of science and faith. BioLogos was actually founded by Francis Collins, who's now the director of the National Institutes of Health. And so before being the head of NIH, Tony Fauci's boss during a pandemic, his previous stint in government service he led the Human Genome Project, And in a brief time before that, he set up a think tank on science and faith. So he's done a lot of stuff. But Deb Harzma, who is a Harvard PhD astrophysicist and a practicing Christian, has written on that. So we're having that discussion. And I think actually someone raised the whole Snyder film series in that discussion on, isn't this a good example? There were people who would be terrified. There would be people who were skeptical and not believing it. You know, just like we have vaccine skeptics, we would probably have Kryptonian skeptics. But you would, I think, find kind of, cultic sort of groups popping up. It would probably form new religious traditions. And yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. It would be, and we may well know the truth about this sometime in the near future about intelligent life from other planets coming here. But can you imagine how that would be, how whatever, all of the reactions would be just exponentially expanded if it turned out that the alien visitor looked just like us, which is of course evolutionarily a real long shot, but looked just like us, could blend into human society, and yet was the most powerful being that we've ever experienced. How people would respond with faith, how people would respond in terror, how governments might respond. It's a huge issue. And again, it goes back to the comics of my youth, where Superman is just, everyone sees as a hero. He's this wonderful guy. And they don't raise that question. Wouldn't people be terrified? Wouldn't people be freaked out by this? And that's why over the last 20 years, we've seen more media that takes that seriously.
I know that's the funny thing, like in Superman the movie, when, that famous classic scene where Lois interviews Superman, and he says he's from Krypton, and she's just, her only question is like, oh, how do you spell that? And it's like,
yes, right. Yeah.
She takes it real well. I do think these modern depictions, whether it's Birthright in the comics or the Man of Steel movies, I do think that is getting at more what it would be. And I think that makes it vastly more fascinating, because it then forces you to think like, how would our world react to something like that? And I mean,
right.
For people of the Jewish faith, they're still waiting for the arrival of the Messiah. And for Christians, the idea is that Christ will come again at the end. Right. Yeah. So it's the sort of thing where, I always think back to one of my favorite movies is It's a Wonderful Life. Truly, like one of my top movies.
You are not alone.
Yes, that was. But, the scene where George and Clarence are at the bar, and, Clarence reveals he's an angel, or he says he's an angel. And Nick, the bartender, is like, what are you talking about? And, Clarence is like, well, don't these people believe in angels? He's like, well, why are they so surprised when they see one? So I always kind of have that in my head. And so it's like, for people of these various faiths who are waiting for someone to come, it's like if someone like that did show up, and, in Man of Steel, for example, he's not out there purporting to be a messiah. This is just what people are projecting onto him. But it's like, I feel like that would happen.
Oh, so, absolutely, it would happen.
Yeah. I know. It's fascinating stuff. So there's a lot that does come out in the conversations with Superman and Father Daniel. They raise a few things that I wanted to kind of, run by you and get your take on. Father Daniel, and I don't have the exact quote, but Father Daniel asks Superman about, I guess, sort of like his feeling about saving people, and how, sometimes people are, truly just dealt a bad hand and they need to save. But Father Daniel gets at this idea that, like, people sometimes make bad choices that then require them to be saved by Superman. And that's kind of an aspect that I found really cool, because in the previous episode of this podcast, we talked about how far Superman should go with his powers. Should he disarm the world of nuclear weapons like he did in Superman 4, The Quest for Peace? But but we typically, and in that episode, and generally, I think we frame it as, well, should he do these things because he can do these things? That's sort of the argument for it. But this added a new layer to it. It's not just that he can, but it's just that he's burdened by people's, mistakes. And it's like, for someone with that power, he would likely have that feeling of like, listen, I can fix this so that you don't have to go through this.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it raises theological, again, religion and politics. It raises theological questions and it raises political questions. Um, what is it Red Sun, the book, the graphic novel where
He's raised
Kal-El's
in
rocket
communist Russia.
it
Yep.
comes in, yeah, the rocket lands in the Soviet Union. And that's a fascinating book because it raises the question of someone this powerful who wasn't raised in this culture that talked about a balance of freedom and responsibility. Uh, of course, it would be extremely easy for Superman to be a dictator, thinking at least that he is completely a benevolent dictator. He's got to save us from ourselves. Uh, and so that's where there are political ramifications, which I did think that Man of Steel, the Snyder film, got, and that many of the comic incarnations of Superman have gotten pretty well. The theological questions that come up are, well, there's really two. There's the age-old question of what's called theodicy, of the problem of evil, and if there is a good God who is all powerful, why is there evil in the world?
Right.
And that's a question that's alluded to, if not directly addressed, kind of in the conversations between Superman and Father Daniel. And it gets into that whole question of free will and making bad choices and, all of these sorts of things. There have been countless attempts in the history of Christian theology to try to explain the problem of evil. And the consensus in the Christian faith is that none of them really work. That is one of those areas for which uh, no one can really articulate a crisp, clear, succinct answer to the problem of evil. But that gets into, and again, I'm not trying to do an agenda here or to preach, but the whole idea at the heart, particularly in the Christian tradition, is this idea of grace, and that which works in two ways. One is acknowledging that we have all made bad choices. So the idea, even though frankly I think Christians are guilty of this constantly, and I can critique my own religious faith, but really at the heart of the Christian tradition, dividing the world into good people and bad people is a fundamental theological error, because there are none of us who have always done the right thing. We have all made bad choices. The idea of God helps those who help themselves from the Christian perspective is a heresy, because what God does, and particularly what Christians believe God has done in Jesus Christ, is to help those who precisely cannot help themselves. And that's why it's an idea of redemption and salvation and rescue and all of that. Which is why, the number one reason I hear from my friends who don't share the Christian faith, or who grew up in it and have walked away and all of that, is they're sick and tired of all the self-righteousness. To which I tend to go, yeah, me too, because it's really a betrayal of the heart of the faith. So that idea of Superman's responsibility to save us from our bad choices is a key way I think it's captured in this book. Again, that's one of those motifs where I'm going to read that and go, yes, that's another echo of the story of Jesus. Uh, Jesus, famously said, when he was accused of hanging out, as the religious leaders of the day did, accused him of hanging out with prostitutes and sinners, his response was, the well don't need a doctor. I came to help the sick. And I think that's an echo. And Superman, being though a mortal being, I think it's fair that he struggles. He has to deal with that question. To what extent come on, you're Superman, right? To what extent am I responsible to rescue all these people for their stupidity? That's a great question. And but from the Christian tradition, is we're like, well, that stupidity is pretty universal, and we're thankful that God loves us in spite of our best efforts otherwise. And so again, for me, I read it and I hear this echo of the really Judeo-Christian teaching on grace and mercy. And they even bring up the question of love. Father Daniel raises that question. Isn't it love that causes you to do this?
Right, because Superman poses this question. He says, how do I know that what I feel is even what the same way that humans feel love? Am I
Right.
feeling the same emotions? How would I know? And I think it's that actually launches them into this conversation about why he saves people and saving them from their own bad
Yes.
choices. And he's like, because I can. And Father Daniel says, well, is that not the definition of love?
Right.
But so there was one thing that I felt was really, it did not ring true for me. It at least the way I think of the character of Superman. Father Daniel has cancer. And
Mm-hmm.
there's this running question of he wonders if Superman can cure it. And at a certain point, he asks Superman point blank, like, can you cure it? And Superman says, I don't know. I've never tried, and I
Yeah.
wouldn't, because then people would expect miracles of me. What was your take on that? Because that did not sit right with me.
Well, I thought it. I'm glad I hadn't thought of that when I was thinking of when I was thinking of things I wanted to say about this about For Tomorrow. I didn't think of that one, and so I'm so glad you brought it up. Yeah, I think it's inconsistent with. I think the writing there is inconsistent. Um, that does not sound like the same character from the very earliest pages of the books and his conversations with Father Daniel. And you have to think that if Superman did exist, if that person, and I want to come back to that whole idea that there's a theme in here about he's Clark, but Bruce is Batman, which is one of the recurring themes, of course, in the Marvel and in the DC world. But I think it's one of the more profound ones in a lot of ways. But if Clark were actually here, would he be constantly using his super hearing to listen to 911 calls and to listen for screams so that he's he's serving as the trestle, the when a trestle's blown to save people from the train? If he were doing all of that, wouldn't he also be going, is there a way that I can use my powers? Can I use, well, this used to happen in the old comics. Can he sort of combine his X-ray and heat vision to do
Right.
like micro cancer surgery? Of course he would think about that, because face it, more people are dying of cancer than people are dying of planes falling out of the sky and evil supervillains blowing up train trestles. Of course he would. And I have to say, as a writer, and again, I'm not trying. I don't want to criticize. I don't want to criticize the book unnecessarily. I think it's an important question. There are certain contrivances to the superhero genre. Okay, and I think that's a good question to ask, but it wasn't answered with anything like a satisfactory way, I thought, in the book. Just that I've never really tried. Yeah, that doesn't ring true to me. And I frankly think it would have been better writing to just leave out that exchange. There's an old expression that I've heard pastors use about sermons that, you know, if you're trying to do a sermon that's, 15, 20 minutes, whatever, Presbyterians tend to preach longer. You grew up Catholic, where a lot of times the sermons were 7 to 8 minutes. I've been in a lot of Catholic, and I'm part of a Protestant Catholic dialogue group that meets out in Chicago regularly, and we make jokes with each other about this. But if you're trying to preach a 15-minute sermon, you know that there are certain things you can't say, because if you use that one sentence, you're going to have at least 10 more minutes to address it. You can't. And I've heard preachers say, don't let loose more snakes than you can kill, in your sermon. And I think there that, yeah, that's a snake that it was just left hanging.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm with you. I'm not out to bash this. I mean, I wouldn't do a whole episode on it if I felt that way about it.
Yeah.
And I do think that, I think there are ways that Superman, and I say Superman in the story, not Clark, or maybe he would prefer to be called Kal-El. That comes up a couple of times here.
Right.
There are a few ways in which he's depicted darker, for lack of a better word, than we often would associate him. But I actually did not have a problem with that because, again, this is a character a year into grief over losing his wife. And so the way he comes across to me is like, no, and I actually did appreciate that we got I mean, I know there have been other, alternate reality stories where Lois is killed and he goes crazy, but I felt like this was a very grounded, very human depiction of what he would be going through. But that exchange about not trying to cure cancer, that did feel very out of character for two reasons. One, the exact reason you said. It just, I don't know, the way I think of the character and the way I think the character would be if he were actually here living in the world. It's like, yeah, if he could, of course. But the bigger issue I had was if he did, then people would expect miracles of him. Well,
yes.
What are all of these feats that he performs if not miracles? Or what makes them different than what this would be?
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why it's an inadequate answer. Because you could do an entire storyline on how have fundamental safety practices decreased in the city of Metropolis since Superman appeared and it was known that Metropolis was his home. Okay?
Yeah.
Are people constantly walking out in traffic or something like this because they know, hey, Superman's around and he'll probably rescue me? So the miraculous feats that he's doing have got to have real world impact. And so if he could cure diseases, I think that was a great question for Father Daniel to ask. I would have personally been happier if Superman had acknowledged that as a limitation. No, that's something I can't do.
Yes. Even if he had said, I tried once, it didn't work. Oh,
exactly.
Okay, that's fine. And then you're like, oh, what's that story? Maybe we'll get to hear it someday,
Yeah, exactly. And I'm happy keeping Superman as largely a hero whose powers are confined to the more physical kind of realm.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure someone at Star Labs is working on a cancer cure. We don't need Superman to do that one.
Right.
But that was, again, it's not a perfect. I don't know that there's any comic book stories that are perfect. I have a Batman one from the 70s. That's my all-time favorite story that I do think is closest to the perfect story. And maybe my all-time favorite arc is also Batman, the old Manhunter stuff with Paul Kirk from the mid to late 70s. But otherwise, there's always issues. My hat's off, though, for tomorrow, because at least they're trying to address these things. I mean, it might not have worked, but at least they gave it a try. That's kind of my thought on that. And most of the story, again, I think most of the story is a good one. There are a few duds. There's a few places where it fell flat.
The way I look at this story, I mean, look, the art is absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, it's superb. And
it was amazing to, and if I had like my buddy Ken Marion on here, we would, I'm sure we would go on and on about he's an artist and I'm sure he, would have a lot to say about that. The art is gorgeous and it was wonderful to see Jim Lee draw the character for an extended time. As far as the story, I guess what I sort of keep coming back to, my overall assessment of it, I think that a lot of the ideas and the questions were the right choice. The ideas that were presented and the questions that were asked were the right ones and were really interesting. It's in some of the execution and some of the answers where I found the story a bit lacking. That's where I kind of land on that. But the one last thing I want to say about this whole like miracles issue, it calls to mind a question / an issue I've always had with Superman the movie, and I'll get into this more when I do that full episode. But Jor-El's warning to Kal-El is, he's not to interfere in the course of human events, right, or human history. Right. And, he tries to stop Superman when he's about to reverse time at the end of the movie. Yet, if he's not supposed to interfere in the course of human events, what is the purpose of putting him in a costume and sending him out there with all of this training.
Right.
What was he supposed to? I mean, I've never been able to like fully wrap my head around that piece of it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It's sort of like the Star Trek Prime Directive. It seems to die the death of a thousand qualifications. Over the whole Star Trek canon. Um, yeah, because don't interfere with the course of human events. I think what they're trying to say is, and I don't buy it, but again, it's part of the comic contrivance. Is Superman should not deliberately affect the flow of history. Okay. So don't overturn governments.
Right.
Don't turn the earth back in time. Um, which I will confess that is my least favorite part of that movie. Um, but okay, well, saving people on a train, saving people in an airliner, saving people from a bomb that's about to go off in downtown Metropolis. That's just a microcosm of human events. But come on, we've all read comics, we've read novels, we've seen movies, even one with this name, on the butterfly effect.
Right.
Uh, it's the whole. If someone had, it's all the contrivances. What if someone had gone back and assassinated infant Adolf Hitler? Um, okay, so it is interfering in the course of human events. Of course, he is, and that distinction between how big a human event can you not interfere with, or how small a one can you interfere with, is kind of arbitrary. But
But I do think
yeah,
I do think your explanation is as satisfactory as one could make to sort of reconcile what seems to be, sort of
yeah,
conflicting advice in that movie. And I will say this, I mean, putting the butterfly effect aside, though we really shouldn't, but to put that aside for argument's sake, as we talked about before, right? This is a world in Superman the movie. This is a world where he can come out and say, "Hey, I'm an alien from Krypton," and everyone's like, "Great."
yeah,
Whereas his presence alone, as the more recent movies have shown, like just his very presence, him floating in the sky, is going to change the world.
right, absolutely.
There's so we've been going for about an hour and 15 minutes. Are you okay doing a little bit more? Because
I'm
I'm
fine.
all right.
I'm good.
If you
Yeah,
want to call this at any point, that's fine. But there are a couple other things I wanted to ask you about.
sure.
There's another scene with Superman and Father Daniel where Superman again flies up, but they're by the river, and
Yep.
Father Daniel's like, "Oh, I thought you were going to walk on water." He doesn't explicitly say it, but he alludes to that. And Superman says, "Like I would never
Right.
play on your faith like that."
Yeah.
And maybe I was reading too much into this, but he said, your faith, and that got me thinking about Clark's faith, which is something that you rarely, or I've rarely seen addressed in stories.
Hmm.
Yet, this is a guy who, again, grew up as a human in the Midwest in a small town. Very likely he was at church every Sunday.
Right. Right. Um, there was actually, and I cannot for the life of me remember where I read this or who wrote it, but it was probably about 20 years ago. I read an article in some magazine or journal uh, speculating on the faith backgrounds of various superheroes in the DC and Marvel universes. And a few we know. We all know that Ben Grimm is
Right.
Jewish. We all know that Matt Murdock is Catholic. There's a few that we know. Um, I can't think of anyone in the DC universe off the top of my head where that's been, at least among the main characters, other than Wonder Woman, who would have been part of the Greco-Roman pantheon of mythology, I would guess. Um, but anyway, they were suggesting, and the article focused a lot on Superman and Batman. And their theory was that Batman had to be either Catholic with a deep sense of guilt, or he had to be a Presbyterian with this deep sense of this is my vocation, to do this. Although there was an old an old Batman comic from back in the 60s or 70s that said that he was a descendant of General Anthony Wayne, who fought in the American Revolution. And from my years my wife and I used to live in Philadelphia, and I have been to Anthony Wayne's grave, and it's in an Episcopal church. So just so you know, but the joke was Superman um, growing up, and of course, comic book characters don't age. But growing up in Kansas when he did, he would probably have been a Methodist. Was their theory? And Simon and Schuster.
Siegel.
Sorry, Siegel. Simon and Siegel. They did not, by having him grow up in Kansas, and actually I can't remember if Kansas was part of their original story or if that comes a little bit later. Probably wasn't Jewish. Not a lot of Jewish farmers in Kansas back in those days. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling on all this.
No.
But yes, I do think it's important though, that he talks about, Daniel's faith, and it raises the question of what Superman's faith might be. And I do think it's, I mean, face it, science fiction has done a lot of work on religion. You've got Star Trek, where Gene Roddenberry's vision originally was that people were pretty much beyond this. And it really took Ronald D. Moore's work on Deep Space Nine to kind of bring religion into the Star Trek universe. Then on the other hand, the reimagined Battlestar Galactica, one of my favorite shows of the last 20 years, it was all about religion, where, the humans were polytheist and the Cylons were monotheist. But I don't know that anyone's ever done that with Superman. Would his discovering his heritage have introduced him to some sort of, whatever Kryptonian religion of his parents? Would he have just adopted the religious faith of his parents? Did Ma and Pa Kent just decide and say, I'm sorry, I'm old enough when they were Ma and Pa and not just Jonathan and Martha?
Oh, I am too, so it's okay.
Yeah, so did they just... they knew their kid was not your typical kid. And so, they just kept him home, and they didn't, maybe religion was not a part of that household. But I mean, if you want to go back to like 40s Kansas, that would have been kind of unusual. I do have a friend who's a comic artist. If I were enough of a comic writer, that's what we could pair up and work on, is the religious background of Clark Kent.
Yeah.
But that was a nice touch, and I did like the fact that Superman is saying in that section, I would never do something that would parody your faith.
Right.
I did appreciate that. I thought that was a nice little. It's kind of a throwaway line, but it was a nice line. It was a nice touch.
And that's a moment that did ring totally true. It's like I would be shocked if Superman walked across the water, like just to rub it in this guy's face. Like that would not feel in character at all.
No.
But I bring this up because I can, off the top of my head, I can only think of, and actually your point though about the Kryptonian religion, because there's like Rao and the Kryptonian, so there is that piece of it, but specifically talking about its potential earthly religion, there are two instances that come to mind in Snyder's Man of Steel, after Clark saves the kids on the school bus from drowning. Then Pete Ross's mother comes over to the house, and she's basically saying like this was an act of God. And then Clark's out on the truck with in the backyard with Jonathan, and Clark says to Jonathan, well, like, why would God do this to me? So there was that. And then
that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
So again, Snyder got into that. Oh, and I want to come back to that when Clark meets with the priest in Man of Steel. I'll circle back to that in a second. But more specifically, I have another instance, because this kind of plays into more of the question that I have is, in Superman For All Seasons, there is a twister that devastates Smallville, and Clark is able to help. He does help, and he saves as many as he can. And then he does have a chat with the local priest during the aftermath of all of this.
Oh, yeah.
And basically the priest says, like, they're like, it was an act of God or something along those lines, and, some things are out of our control. And Clark says, well, but what if there was someone who could do something? And I guess that's sort of like the big picture question I have of what it would be like if you were Clark Kent growing up, and especially talking about a post-crisis Clark Kent who he wasn't super baby. His powers emerged as he got older, right? So he grows up largely as a normal person, right? And then his powers start to kick in. But, he grows up as a human, learning as we all do. And whether you call it, a force of nature or a freak accident or an act of God, whatever it is, this idea that, well, there are some things that are beyond your control, some things that just kind of need to happen, or you can't do anything about it. I guess, like, how does it mess with your head if you then realize, you then become the person who
Right.
could stop something, who there might be an act of God, but you might be strong enough to push it back. Like, what do you do with it? I think that's such a fascinating piece of this.
Oh, I think it is. And I mean, face it, it's the Spider-Man origin story. With great power comes great
Right.
responsibility. It's just that with Superman, that gives a whole new meaning to the phrase "with great power." And again, it ain't easy growing up to be Superman because of those responsibilities. And that's where uh, I haven't read for all seasons since it was new. I have those individual issues in a little box somewhere. Um, and I can't remember, was that before or after? When did that come out?
That was like 98.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's before. It does make me, I had forgotten that whole dialogue. It does make me wonder if that fed into into For Tomorrow. Um, yeah, if that was an influence. But yeah, I do agree with you. That is the question. What if someone can do something about it? And that's where all the personal, the existential tension in these stories comes from. And you know, what can I do? What should I do? What is helpful? What will do more harm than good? And just wrestling with those things. And again, the books, again, that's where the Superman continuity does not, he's not all knowing in that sense. He is still, uh, you know, he is still he's not a human being, but he is still he is a man, to use a line that gets picked up in a lot of Superman stories. He's a man, and he has human slash Kryptonian finitude. So he doesn't know the answers to all of these questions, and he has to wrestle with them. Uh, which is, of course, why the modern continuities where he comes into his powers in adolescence are so much more interesting than when I was a kid and you had, Super Baby and, the Superboy stuff. Superboy, I was interested in because I was a big fan of the Legion of Superheroes. But the standalone Superboy comics, I just, never cared. So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just something that I was thinking about. Again, especially, you know, if he were brought up in really any faith, but if he was a
Yeah.
Methodist or but any faith, and sort of this idea of, an act of God, that certain things that, especially when we're talking about, something like a twister or other natural events, like,
Right.
something like that, where it's like, yeah, would your faith versus what you're able to do, like you said, like you have that tension, like really butt up against each other. It's like, well, is this supposed to happen? Should I not be doing this? It's yeah, really a fascinating piece. The thing I wanted to circle back to and ask you about. So in For Tomorrow, we have all of these scenes where Father Daniel, is counseling Superman, and similarly in Man of Steel, before Clark
Hmm.
reveals himself to the world, Zod has issued this challenge. He's going to start attacking the Earth unless Kal-El reveals himself. And Clark goes into the church and just sits down, and he has this heart to heart with the priest. I mean, I guess, and again, this might sound like a silly question. I don't mean it to be, but I don't know. Is there, as a member of the clergy yourself, like as you read those scenes, watch those scenes, do you think like, oh, like I agree with the advice they give, or I would have said this instead?
Actually, in both of those cases, I thought the advice was pretty good. I really do. Both in Man of Steel and in For Tomorrow. Um, that was the part of the dialogue in For Tomorrow that most rang true for me, and particularly as it's established that Father Daniel is struggling with with his own demons. I mean, his own grief and his own sense of loss. We meet the police officer that was obviously his love interest, and before he took his vows, and there's that sense of grief that he's dealing with as well. Uh, but yeah, I thought the priest in Man of Steel, um, did a pretty good job. Um, Again, it was that active listening and sort of, what sort of a what do you think you need to do? Um, yeah, so I thought that was a pretty good description. I am a pretty good depiction. I Knowing now that Henry Cavill's that he likes for tomorrow. Makes me. I would love to know if Father Daniel is sort of the inspiration for the priest in Man of Steel. Um, don't know Zack Snyder. Don't know. Can't ask him that. I don't think I can call him up and ask him, but I would be interested in that. Maybe somebody listening to this knows something about that too.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was Snyder or David Goyer, the screenwriter. I mean, yeah, maybe. I mean, they might have taken some inspiration from,
Yeah.
from For Tomorrow. But yeah, it was an interesting. The one thing about that scene though that that didn't quite work for me is the way Clark just gets up and leaves. It felt, I don't know, it felt like their conversation was, I guess he got what he needed out of the conversation, but it just sort of felt like, all right, I guess that's it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe that confirms that he grew up Methodist and he really didn't know how to talk to a priest. Maybe that's it.
But yeah, and that was at a point in his journey, right, where this was the big decision. It's like, is he going to reveal himself? And I know that I know that one of the criticisms of Man of Steel was that by Zod showing up and calling him out, that it basically let all the air out of the balloon as far as Clark's journey and this tension of whether he's going to reveal himself. I don't agree with that because he could have hidden and he chose not to. I mean, yes, this did force his hand. It made it an issue before maybe it would have been otherwise, but there was still a choice to be made there. And I did really like the scene with with the priest and the questions that the priest was asking him, because the whole thing is Clark doesn't know if he can trust, the world or the U.S. government specifically.
Right.
And, the priest asks him about Zod, and and he says, "Well, my gut is like he can't be trusted." And then it just comes down to this fate, this leap of faith that he has to take.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's absolutely right. And it doesn't. I agree with you, by the way. I don't think that criticism is valid because, first of all, it's already been established that while he might not have been costumed, and he didn't know he could fly, which I thought was kind of a fascinating point. And frankly, one of my one of my favorite visual tricks. I don't know what you call it, visual motif in Man of Steel is when he's pressing his fist into the ground and you see the pebbles start to float, which then of course gets repeated at the end of Batman v Superman. I just that to me when I first saw Batman versus Superman, I actually didn't love the film. I did go back in the spring and watch the extended cut, which I enjoyed better. Having seen the Snyder cut, I felt like I understood it better. But that was my favorite thing in the whole Batman versus Superman was the very end as the pebbles start rising off the casket. But it wasn't like Clark was not a hero before Zod called him out, because that's how Lois found him. She kept finding these stories of these great superhuman heroic actions. So the idea that Clark is in his heart a hero, someone who really wants to serve and to help others, that was established very early on before Zod called him out. So yeah, I don't think that's a valid criticism. Yeah. I also don't think the criticism that Superman doesn't kill, I don't know that that's a valid criticism either, because I mean, if that was the only, if in Superman's heart of hearts he believed that was the only option in order to save potentially dozens, hundreds, thousands of lives, what do you do? I didn't think, I thought that criticism did not ring true for me. The only thing, frankly, I didn't like about Man of Steel when I first saw it was just the complete widespread destruction everywhere at the end. And I kept thinking, this is over the top, this is gratuitous, this is for the foreign audiences. I mean, I don't know what's going on with this. I don't know why they're doing this. But then, of course, Batman versus Superman deals with that it becomes, that widespread destruction becomes exactly what motivates Bruce to be so concerned about the ramifications of having this alien being here on the planet. So that's where, actually sort of watching those movies retrospectively has helped me like all of them better. So
I love hearing that. And I think that
Yeah.
because the same thing has been true for me, and I've talked about this. I mean, I had some mixed feelings about both Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. While I overall enjoyed them both the first time, there were some mixed feelings, and it was upon subsequent viewings and also watching them together in the context of this larger story that it's like, oh yeah, like you see. And, exactly, to your point about the destruction of Metropolis. I mean, I think it shows a more realistic scale to
Hmm.
something like this that you don't often
Right.
see in these superhero movies. It's like, yeah, if there were these superpowered beings throwing each other around, they would level a city. It would be catastrophic. And on top of that, yeah, that fuels Bruce's hate in the next movie and really carries things forward. And, this was a Clark who, this was his first day on the job. So it's like,
Right.
in the future, yeah, he probably will know, and he does, to move things, to a deserted area. He doesn't, and he's just fighting to stay alive. And then the killing of Zod, this has come up, man, and I can't tell you in how many episodes this has
Oh,
come up.
yes. Right.
But everyone has an opinion on it, and it's always great to get it. And I don't want to say pleasantly surprised. I mean, your opinion is your opinion. If you didn't like it, that's fine. But because I agree with you, and I think that I know some fans look at it as like, well, he could have flown Zod up in the sky, and it's like I genuinely think the intent of this scene was to show you. And maybe they could have staged it different. I don't know. But I genuinely believe the intent of this scene was to show that Clark, to your point, truly didn't think he had another option. Even if
Yes.
even if he could have flown Zod up into the sky, the first chance Zod had, he would have come back down and he would have gone after that family or a different family. That was the
Yes,
point of this. Like,
exactly.
that's what Zod had conveyed. Like, there was no stopping him like, he forced Clark's hand.
Exactly. And it's the whole, I mean, because since the emotional theme of this entire movie is just how difficult it is to live in this world with these powers and that sense of responsibility, that's really the capstone of that. It's not like, uh, you know, Superman at the end of Man of Steel is not, he's not like an old caricature of the 70s and 80s revenge movie. He's not like firing at the heat vision to say, go ahead, make my day. You can, I think it comes across very clearly that yes, he had to kill Zod because he felt that that was the only choice he had, and it was a horrible choice. He he felt
Yeah.
terrible about it. It was clear. And so that criticism, um, especially as I've thought about it and watched the movies kind of in reverse order again, that changes things.
These
In
movies
that
age
universe, I
well.
still haven't watched Aquaman. I need to go back and do that, but this is not
Yeah,
the Aquaman podcast. So
Aquaman is fun, but the Snyder movies, I do think they age well, and I do think that they really do benefit from multiple viewings. And when I put out these episodes where we talk about this stuff, what I hear more than anything else, thankful, and this is great, is people saying like, oh, like whether it was listening to us or maybe listening to us like motivated them to watch it again, like, oh, like I kind
yeah,
of see it in a little different way. I think that's wonderful. I don't want to keep you much longer. One of the last things I just wanted to bring up was,
yeah,
um, we were talking about these parallels between, Superman and Jesus. I mean, I guess, one question I had is, are there any other parallels that we don't often clock that you might see? Because the one other thing that I thought of is, and again, I know I'm not, this isn't, the first time anyone's noticed this, but, in terms of, both Superman and Clark and Jesus, working with their hands, the learning the
hmm,
trade of their fathers. And what I really do love about the journey of Clark Kent is that, yes, he has this career as a reporter, and that's a big piece of him. And I love that. I love the
hmm,
journalism aspect of the character. But, he grows up farming, and in a lot of the stories, kind of getting us closer to the end of his journey, there's often a return to working with his hands. And whatever happened to the Man of
hmm,
Tomorrow, he lives this powerless life as a mechanic. On the new
hmm,
Superman and Lois TV show, he's not at the end of his journey, but he's returned to the farm to kind of center himself and reconnect
right,
with his family. In Zack Snyder's Justice League, after he's brought back to life, and I just talked about this in another episode, but like one of the things that brings him back emotionally is standing out there in the fields that he worked with his
yes,
father. So
yes.
I really love that aspect of this.
Oh, I think now here's where I have to confess, and I'm the one who teaches the Bible for a living. I had never thought about that connection between Joseph and Jesus, and Jonathan and Clark. That is, I think that's actually very insightful. So my hat's off to you or anybody else who's come up with that. But yes, I think that's certainly a theme. Well, it's a theme in the Gospels because Jesus does continually find himself back in Nazareth, the city that he grew up in, where he is often rejected. Um, he makes the line about no prophet is without honor except in his own hometown and among his own kin. Jesus says at one point, back about 15 years ago, I was approached by a church in my hometown and about what I consider moving there and leading that church. And I joked with Ann, that's the only verse in the entire New Testament I could think of when I was asked. Is no prophet is without honor except in his own hometown. Um, I think that's a very important parallel. And it gets back to what I alluded to a while ago, and this is mentioned in when there's this exchange between Superman and Batman in For Tomorrow, and where Batman's getting his attention. He calls him Clark, and Clark says, "My name is Kal-El," but then he says Batman, and of course Batman's response is, "My name is Bruce," and he goes, "No, you're Batman. Bruce is the mask." And of course, more people than we could count have pointed that out. That, but in his heart of hearts, where truly that's right for Batman, at least in the Dark Knight, Batman and the darker versions of Batman, not the '60s one that I grew up with, but Bruce is the mask, and the Christopher Nolan films brought that out very well. That he is Batman, but that's not true of Superman. Superman is the costume, and this guy is Clark. He's Kal-El, and he's Clark. That's how he sees himself, and I think there's a powerful storyline, and I've had a few people mention this. Um, I have a number of friends who are adopted, and they find deep resonance in the Superman stories. That Jonathan and Martha are his parents just as much, or if not more so than Jor-El and Laura. Uh, and that he worked alongside his father, which Man of Steel draws that out very, very well, and that he keeps coming to the land. And now maybe that's another motif that could be picked up from the Jewish heritage of the whole idea of there's a homecoming, that there's a holy land, as it were, for Clark that he comes to. And I will say I don't think anyone's ever touched that as well as Snyder did. That Clark doesn't even quite know who he is when he's been brought back to life, and but somehow he instinctively ends up in that field in Kansas. That's his true home. That's his heart's true home. I think that's a very, very powerful imagery, and and again, not to wax too philosophical or theological, but it picks up. That's a recurring theme in both Judaism, particularly in certain of the Psalms, of this return to home, this return to where we truly belong. And in the Christian spiritual tradition, particularly in the more contemplative and mystical sides of that, there's been this huge emphasis on how God is the heart's true home, and so the idea of a homecoming is pretty important in the Christian theological tradition. But I do think so. There's yet another echo that uh, that farm outside Smallville, Kansas, is home,
Yeah.
and that's his true identity right there. That's who he really is. He's not really Clark Kent. That's an adopted name given to him on an adopted planet, but that's who he is. Where Bruce Wayne is his real name, but who he becomes post trauma is really this other figure.
I
So
agree. Yeah, and
Yeah.
well, and in terms of another echo, I mean, because I've talked about this many, many times, and it'll keep coming up because I mean, this is really getting to the bones of the character here, where, again, as far as another echo, the 3-in-1, where I really look at this trinity within the character of Superman, where I mean, I agree with you. I don't think Superman is who he really is. That's a costume he puts on. He becomes a symbol.
Yeah.
I don't believe that Clark Kent is only a disguise, but I do believe that the Clark
Right.
Kent reporter, there is obviously an element of disguise, and he has to,
Of
and
course, there's an
and
element of that.
there's an element of
Yeah.
disguise, but it's like Clark on, or Cal, but Clark on the farm. That's really
That's
that's
yes.
who he is. So I agree with that. And then also, again, you do get the the 3-in-1. So we have another Christian echo there.
Well, yeah, there's Superman, there's Kal, and there's Clark. I think the working with his hands is an important bit too of the character, because that's what Superman's his good deeds, his rescuing actions are primarily physical. Where Batman, who grew up in more of an intellectual family, and his father was a physician, there's all of this. Batman works with his mind. And that's not just his sort of strategic leadership in Justice League and those kinds of things, not just in the movie, but I mean, in the comics. Because, what's this guy doing among these superpowered beings? Well, they depict him as kind of the brains of the operation. And he is a detective, which apparently the next cinematic incarnation of Batman is really planning to play up the detective aspects, which I would welcome that. So
I'm very excited for that aspect to
yeah,
really get its due as well. I really did like the scene between Superman and Batman in For Tomorrow. My favorite part was when Batman throws a punch and Superman uses his super speed to dodge it. And he's like, next time I'm not going to do that. And you're going to end up with every bone in your hand broken.
right.
Which, I like when Clark gets a little tough. And I felt like that was
Yeah.
justified in that scene. Is there anything else about For Tomorrow that we didn't talk about that you wanted to?
Well, I will say, if anybody watching or listening to this if you're not familiar with it or you want to go back and get it, uh, there is a few pages at the end of the all-in-one version of the graphic novel where there's conversations with Jim Lee and where he is describing his approach to the art. And he goes into quite a bit of detail about how to, he wanted to incorporate some elements from Golden Age and Silver Age Superman. He particularly tried to incorporate that Kryptonite No More cover from the 70s. Uh, but he goes in, and not being an artist, I didn't follow it as much as the artists who are listening to this. Like I said, I have a close friend who's a comic artist in his early 30s, and very talented, named Zach Brunner. He's been on the I think his most recent comic work was the series Plague, and I'm sorry that I cannot remember the publisher right now. But anyway,
Cool.
uh, but Jim Lee talks about trying to make a darker version of Superman and incorporating more shadow into the character, and how that's a contrast with these very, very bright colors. He talked about how he didn't want to mute the colors. He wanted the colors to be full and bright, but in contrast with how he uses shadow and darkness. And particularly, he goes into a lot of detail about how important Superman's cape is to how he approaches the art, which I think is also true of his work with Batman and Hush. But which again, I picked up Hush as a graphic novel years ago. I didn't read it when it first came out, but I picked it up largely on the basis of the cover art alone. Sometimes you almost can judge a book by its cover. So anyway, but that's worth getting. It's worth reading.
Yeah, I really appreciate, all the insight you shared. I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought this was very interesting. I hope the audience agreed. It's funny because the previous episode of this podcast was about the morality and ethical duty of Superman. And we talked about, again, should Superman disarm the world of nuclear weapons? Was it right to kill Zod? We touched on all of that.
Yeah.
And then we have this episode. So, I know these two together, were a little bit more philosophical and thoughtful. But I guess it's stuff that I've had kicking around in my head about the character, and I really think they're topics worth exploring. I think it really highlights the richness of the character and how much there really is there to mine.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is where I'm assuming most of the people who are going to watch or listen to this podcast know the comics world pretty well. Most of them, better than me. I have fairly pedestrian taste in comics. I mostly just read DC and Marvel stuff. I'm not as I don't read some of a lot of the independent publishers, but since I mentioned earlier my wife's comment about she didn't know I was into this comics stuff when she first met me, and I will have to say, several years ago, a mutual friend of ours said something to Anne about Anne is my wife, and said, I cannot believe that your husband knows all this stuff about comic books and is so into comic books. Said he's really smart and he knows all this theology. I just can't believe he's into comic books. And to her credit, my wife looked at him and said, do you know anybody else who reads comic books? My experience is this is some of the smartest people you will ever hang out with. And I was not in the room. I heard this secondhand. So I was delighted, and that's true. And so people who, my non-comic friends out there don't know what they're missing. So all the people who have been watching these Snyder films and watching the Marvel films, which are uneven, I think, but I enjoy them, and are realizing, wow, there's a lot of profundity that's, profound questions are being asked here. Difficult things are being wrestled with. Well, yes, of course they are. And even back in when I was a kid, I mean, my earliest childhood memory, I think I've told you this before, I was hearing my uncle on Christmas Eve of 1965, when I was 4.5, say to my dad, his brother-in-law, hey, did you know they're doing a Batman TV show? I said, who's Batman? And he went into his room and gave me a stack of comic books, and he created a monster. But I can also remember being 9 years old when the new run on Green Lantern and Green Arrow came out.
Sure, the hard
And
traveling heroes.
oh yes, and that was a watershed moment. I bought that book at the local drugstore. I went home and read it. Was very upset because I was 9 years old and I liked Green Lantern, fighting space aliens and things like this. And then read it again, and then read it again, and honestly became frankly, probably one of the most important books I read in that period in my life. And it's when I realized, wow, these comics can ask some good questions. Ever since the African American guy asked Hal Jordan, you work for the purple skins and you've done considerable for the orange skins, but there's one skins you've never worked with, the black skins. And I'm asking you, how come, Mr. Green Lantern? Well, that was a moment for me when I realized, wow, comics can be powerful.
Very, very well said. And, especially when we're talking about a character like Superman, but, Green Lantern's been around for decades as well. But, with Superman, 80 plus years, a character that's been around that long, there must be something there. And you've had all of these creators across media, working on it and all infusing it with, all of these different aspects. And so there's a tremendous amount to explore. Real quick final question, because I meant to ask you this. Have you ever used comics in either counseling someone or a sermon? Like, have you ever had that sort of crossover between your job and your hobby?
Sermon, absolutely. I'm sure I have done that. In counseling, I don't know. It wasn't like a classic counseling session, but I was I think it was during COVID, in a phone conversation with a parishioner. We got into a discussion of comics, and I recommended that he read, again, it's my favorite Batman story from like 1974. It was called Night of the Stalker. If you don't know the story, can't even remember. It was Jim Aparo maybe did the art. I can't remember now. But Batman does not have a single word of dialogue in the story. And so I remember telling him about that book and going, you should read this. But yes, I will. I one of my oldest daughter's friends. This is the mother of my new grandchild. Once one of her friends once said, "Can you do a sermon without quoting Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or Harry Potter or a comic book?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm sure I can, but that would be boring." And the fact of the matter is, now I don't have to explain so much because,
Right.
thanks to the popularity of a lot of these movies, um, more people know the story. so, I think in the past, especially when I was in campus ministry, I could use this kind of stuff if I was teaching a Bible study or having some sort of roundtable discussion with a few other students who bought comic books at Gallup's Pawn, Gun, and Comic Shop. I kid you not, in Statesboro, Georgia. Great comic shop. And there were a few other students I worked with when I was their campus minister who were into comics, and we could talk about it. But it's not like I could say, with great power comes great responsibility, and anybody would know what that meant until Tobey Maguire came along. So.
Yep, it's true. The adaptations have definitely gone a long way towards, bringing these characters to the masses. Pastor Craig, thank you very, very much for being part of this episode. I really appreciate it. This was great.
Well, thank you, Anthony. This has been a delightful way to spend a couple hours. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Pastor Craig, and I want to thank our listeners and viewers for checking out this episode. Remember that on the Patreon companion show in 1 week, we'll have a discussion of The Suicide Squad, directed by James Gunn. And then 2 weeks from now, on Digging for Kryptonite, it's the beginning of our 8-part weekly event, Crisis Till Death. Do not miss it. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production, art by Greg Schiegel, music by Basic Printer. Join the conversation by becoming part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group. Follow Digging for Kryptonite on Instagram and Twitter, and visit flatsquirrelproductions.com to explore more of my film and podcast projects.